Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning into our discussion about generative AI tools and how they're impacting the ways that educators think about designing curricula and assessing students' skills and competencies. To speak to us about this topic, we're joined by Lance Eaton, who is the Director of Faculty Development and Innovation at College Unbound. Lance is also a part-time instructor at the North Shore Community College and a Ph.D. student at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. Lance's work and research engage with the possibility of digital tools for expanding teaching and learning communities while considering the implications of educational technologies on higher ed. You've also likely encountered Lance's list of syllabi policies for generative AI tools, which has been shared widely by several institutions. Next, we're joined by Amanda Ellis, who is an assistant professor and the vice chair of the Department of Biostatistics at the University of Kentucky. Amanda oversees the graduate curriculum in her department as the director of the Master of Science in Biostatistics program. Amanda and her co-author Emily Slade recently published an article about how students and educators can use ChatGPT to enhance statistics and data science education. And last but not least, we're joined by Anna Mills, who has taught community college English for 18 years and currently teaches at Cañada College. Anna serves on the MLA CCCC Task Force on Writing. It is CCCC, not quadruple C. Okay, perfect. She served on this task force on writing in AI and curates an AI resource list for the Writing Across the Curriculum Clearinghouse. Anna has published an open textbook titled How Arguments Work and has recently published essays on AI in the Chronicle of Higher Education and Inside Higher Ed. Thank you, panelists, for joining us today, and I look forward to our discussion. So generative AI is a hot topic in higher ed, which is why we're all here. And it's become a hot topic, particularly because of the widespread adoption of tools like ChatGPT. So I thought I would kick off the discussion today with a question from an audience member named Ali Rivera, who is at UVA. Ali asked, how are Gen AI tools being used by college instructors, and which tools show the most promise in education planning, content creation, and benefits among students? Thank you, Ali, for the question. Audience members, I would really love to read your thoughts on this question, so please share in the chat. And I will start with Lance.
Thank you so much, Stella and Michaela, and just the opportunity to be here. So I always like to start with that. This is a fun and challenging question. I've had a lot of talks with, at this point, thousands of faculty in the last year, and I think there's like a large bucket who aren't using any tools yet, who are still trying to figure out like which tool to use or how to put that like step into that tsunami of all the things around AI. The ones that are popping up the most are the most popular ones, right? So a lot of folks are just starting to play with ChatGPT and may start playing with like the paid version. What I see the most of is institutions that have Microsoft. More and more folks are playing with Copilot if it gets turned on. And similarly with Google, folks are starting to play more with some of Google tools, although given last week's debacle around Gemini and image depiction, we'll see if that continues to be the case. The one that pops up that exciting isn't the right word, but like I appreciate seeing is some portion of faculty are interested in perplexity.ai, in part because you don't need an account. And I think that's another piece of it. But I think there's a lot of hesitation about trying to even like commit to a tool, because so much of what like around educational planning, content creation, benefits with students, so much of that is enwrapped in like what is safe and appropriate to use based on our institutional policy. And lots of institutions don't have policy yet. And when they do, they still don't have a tool that they have like sanctioned, that they've had some agreement with.
Okay, thank you. Amanda?
Yeah, so I would say at my institution, ChatGPT is by far the most popular that I hear. And then secondary to that, similar to what Lance said, would be tools that are already coupled with something that people are already using. So another one that I've played with a little bit, which its capabilities are still fairly low, but I think will increase, is Canva. So I've used Canva a ton before to, just create different visual things for my courses, but they now have an AI tool embedded to help create different slides and things like that. Grammarly is another good one. So tools that are already embedded in tools that people were already using, if that makes sense, seem to be the most popular that I'm seeing.
You use both of those tools here at ADSA. Anna, would you like to chime in?
Yeah, I think just in addition, I do see some interest in research tools and a growing number of apps like elicit.org, Kenius, Consensus, and then Lance mentioned Perplexity that allows you to search just academic sources if you want. So sort of as a supplement to, or instead of the academic database search process through the library, we have this other way to approach research questions, which includes kind of follow-up questions and summaries of that research. So I do think that is useful. My approach to that is to sort of look at how can we do this with guardrails. So, I've been consulting like on a volunteer basis for this teacher created app called My Essay Feedback.ai. And the idea there is that we want to have the teacher sort of supervising and chiming in, and we want to have the app prompting students to reflect critically on what it's giving them. So there's a piece where they're building their own voice and their own confidence and their critical AI literacy. So, that's one way to do this. And it's also sort of, privacy vetted and officially connected to the LMS and vetted by the IT department. So that's, the walled garden approach. And I think that you're increasingly seeing more and more apps trying to market to colleges that have, very interesting functionality like Packback, Power Notes, and it's this question of how do you have these conversations about the price tag and should it be a priority and what can we do with the free version? You also see some people who want to use open source and kind of maybe less advanced tools, partly to build critical AI literacy. Because if you have a clunkier result, you can talk more about what's under the hood and what a token is, and sort of get a visceral sense that it's doing statistics rather than just the sense of how amazing it is, right? So people look at those Hugging Face models also for that.
Yeah, so you just outlined in your response some of the potential drawbacks of using AI, which is privacy issues, and then also just ensuring that throughout the process that students are developing critical AI literacy. Because of the question that we've just got in our chat, I'm wondering if anybody else wants to share their thoughts on the potential risks and drawbacks from using GAI tools.
I don't mind to start this one. I think for me, when I think about how I teach and what I'm teaching my students, with any tool, I worry, is it impacting their learning in some way? Are they missing some critical part of the learning process? And I think that's one of the risks with AI tools, is if they're used inappropriately, the students may inadvertently miss out on some of those learning steps. And I think of this especially in my undergraduate students, particularly my freshmen and my sophomores. Are they using AI tools to kind of skip some of those learning steps? And so, having conversations with my students about how that risk is there and then why those learning steps are really important is one thing that I really strive to do, because, at the end of the day, they're going to be the one that chooses to use the tool and how to use the tools. And so having those conversations with them are very important to me, to make sure that they understand, if you use a tool this way, you might be missing out on this important learning aspect. And so they at the end of the day, they make that choice themselves.
I'll jump in there. I'll also give a shout out to Gil, who is a friend and colleague of mine. So I appreciate him throwing that in there. I think I agree with Amanda about like the challenge around what might be missed. There's a whole, like, in my mind, a sub question and challenge about all of the assumptions we have about how we learn, and that we see all this grapple around technology. Whenever new technology arrives, like it's gonna change. Like this is very like we're having a moment that's very similar to the like social media, to the Wikipedia, to the internet. So like I think it's an important question to always be looking for. Oh, sorry, my this bear has thoughts on it too. Um, it's a challenge we're always trying to figure out, and I don't know that we always do figure it out. So I think we're still stuck in understanding its impact in learning. I me For me, the bigger concern is the quickness of the normalization of it. And I'll be like, I've played some role in this in the ways I've talked about it and the things that I do, like the quickness of it and it becoming something that is just like it's now everywhere. um and then the expectations to work with it, and it's like right now a lot of it is framed in this we it's giving us it's giving us time, supposedly, right? Like it's saving us time to do X or Y. But in 5 years, when it becomes the norm to use this, all of that time disappears. So to me, it's like it's this tool promising save time and more efficient productivity that then just puts us into that hyper productivity loop where like it's like every 3 months I have to do a report at work, and the report is just a stand-in for whatever. And in 5 years, I have to do that report every week, and I'm doing it with the help of generative AI, but it still takes a lot of intellectual capacity. And then it's just being read by another generative AI, and then being like, you know, like there's just the highlights being given to somebody else to read and be like, okay, good, and moving along. So like there's something about this for me that feels a little um, pushing further on the outputs of human capacity in a society and in a culture in which we are seeing all sorts of things around quiet quitting and burnout and those types of things. Like those aren't disconnected. So that's like the bigger uh, potential risk I feel is how much it puts us on that hamster wheel even faster.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I also want to circle back to, I think one of the assumptions too is often that students are comfortable with using these tools. And Lance, you were on a podcast earlier last year, and um, you talked about concerns from students who may not want to share their data with tools like ChatGPT. That is really interesting. So you created a shared account for your class to use. And so I was wondering, did this help address students' concerns? And if you could just share more about what you learned from doing that.
Yeah, the context was it was a course on generative AI in education, and the goal of it was at our institution, we were working with students to develop our teaching and learning, our student and faculty policy around generative AI appropriate uses. And so we're gonna have to use the tools. I and this was like January of last year, so like ChatGPT is like 2 months old. It didn't feel right for me to say go and get an account because an earlier version, I don't know if it's still true, but an earlier version of ChatGPT, to sign up, like you had to give over your phone number. And like our phone numbers are our modern social security numbers. Like that is our identifying number. And I didn't feel right at a school, at an institution that is um, filled with students who have been alienated by traditional higher ed to be like, go hand over your information. So yeah, I set up an account and said like, you can set up your own account. We have concerns because like we know nothing about OpenAI. And then OpenAI also just had gotten, I don't know what, like a ginormous investment by Microsoft. And I was like, and now Microsoft is deeply involved. Like I wanted to be responsible to students. So I was like, you can use it, just know these things. Like we're not entirely sure what's being done with the data, or you can use this fake account. And down the line, I think 3/4 of the students use the account, which was also cool on the flip side because we all had access to it. We could actually learn and see how different people were using it. So in both sessions of that course, the majority of students took advantage of that because they weren't coming in as like with, you know, the like complete, you know, everything's sunny. They did have concerns. They did have this awareness of how and what data is being used for.
Yeah, thank you. Anna, you unmuted. Please hop in.
No, I just want to second that and to say that I'm inspired by Katie Conrad's blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights for education, and how she talks about students having a right to an alternative if they're not comfortable with the tool that the instructor is assigning. So that's kind of a baseline for me, that I would offer an alternative. And another approach is, you know, I'll invite students to prompt a system on their own, but I'll also offer a chat transcript for them to annotate if they prefer to just sort of comment on a chat session that's already, that I've had with it. But I mean, there are questions on ethics on so many levels. And so part of what I think that I want to do is to preface any use of the systems with some readings about them, some initial critical AI literacy, and then to sort of continue that as a theme, even if we're using them, right? And maybe we use them with some ambivalence, and maybe we sort of critique them as we use them. That's what I've come to, rather than just saying too many issues, let's not do it. It's like, well, this is the world. This is something we need to know about. It can be useful in these limited ways. It can also be distracting. That's another concern that I have, right? And I'll admit to my students that sometimes, you know, this tool is so amazing, and wouldn't it be cool if I used it pedagogically in this way? And I want to try it, right? And I'm always looking at those websites I put in the chat and going, oh, that's amazing. I want to do that. But I do try to hold back, and I actually am fairly conservative on how much of my, what percent of my assignments involve AI use. Because, you know, there are fundamental things that I teach that shouldn't go away, you know, and the AI is so amazing that that can be distracting. So I've got to sort of keep the focus on the existing learning outcomes, figure out where it fits in, where it's exciting and helps with those learning outcomes, and where maybe it's an extra credit assignment, right?
Do you mind if I jump in?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
You know, it's interesting, this idea of what students think about generative AI. And so one of the things I did this semester, a fairly small course, it's got 35 students in it. It's a junior level biostatistics course. And so I was curious, what were the students' perceptions, particularly of ChatGPT. And so what I did was I gave the students a very short survey. And in the survey, I asked them a couple questions like, have you ever used ChatGPT before? And then I also asked them, what 3 words do you associate with ChatGPT? And we did this before I had ever talked about it in class. And it was interesting because I found majority of my class were already using it. But when I made a word cloud of their responses, the largest word was cheating. That was the biggest word in the word cloud. And so, and I wonder 2 things. Is some of the hesitation from educators in the conversation around these tools, is that influencing students' perception of these tools? And I think it is in a large way. And then I also wonder how students' conversations with one another are influencing their perception of the tools. And so I think as educators, it's really important for us also how we frame these conversations and how students are hearing these conversations.
Can I jump in? Because
Yes.
that question about framing, like right out of the gate with ChatGPT, that was the thing. A lot of, I mean, The Atlantic came out with the article, you know, the death of the college essay. And that set a frame that I was certainly concerned about, and concerned about particularly at the institution that I'm at. Again, we have students who traditional higher ed has not worked for them. And so the idea that all of a sudden out of the gate, people are thinking about this in that way. What happened, the reason I ended up teaching that course is because in December of 2022, a faculty member, a colleague friend, Autumn Keynes, comes to me as like, I think a student might be using it. And we had this great moment where like, we are both from this very critical perspective about even how we talk about cheating or all of those things. And like, we both had this moment of like, hot shit, way to go. Like, what a creative way. We don't even know if the student used it, which is, I think, another piece of all of the questions around cheating, because we can't really do that. But in that moment, us having that response of just hey, that's actually 3 weeks this tool's been around and somebody's finding a useful way of doing it, led to us doing a survey at our school to find out how students are using it. And then in the course, like that, one of the most interesting things that I'm still sitting with is a student who was like, I actually took it to organize my notes. Like, she's like, there's a 35-year-old woman. She's like, I know I'm not a note organizer. Like, I'm just gonna take them and then put them aside and not think about them until I have to write the actual paper. And like was able to do this, have ChatGPT organize the notes and then get to the paper sooner. And so I think what you're saying, like to what you're saying, is like the reaction, and there's good reasons for it. It stresses us all out to have to change lots of things, but that reaction is something that misses that opportunity of where could this actually really help students in ways that like are gonna be hurdles that are either unnecessary, or students know like this is just like 35. She knows like I have not yet organized my notes, but like wants to do the work, the actual work of writing the paper. So I think that resonates strongly from my experience.
Yeah, thank you. This brings me back to a question that we touched on a little bit behind the scenes before the panel got started. And it's the question about the challenges and opportunities of using generative AI tools in different disciplines, but also thinking about the types of students that you all are serving. And so thinking about your graduate level versus undergraduate, thinking about just the diversity of students. This is perfect time to actually talk about Amanda, your paper. I want to mention this paper that you published with Emily Slade, because I thought it was really fascinating that when you generated these responses by ChatGPT, you found that they weren't entirely accurate when given prompts to define p-values and confidence intervals. And it was so nuanced that you would have to have a statistics background or some training in it to actually catch that. So I thought that was really interesting. And so I'm sort of curious about, particularly in fields like STEM or data science, statistics, do you find that the concerns are different than, say, people who are in humanities or social sciences or just different fields?
You know, it's funny. I do think there are some concerns that are field specific. But what I find, I have seen more, and I should say I'm seeing it less as more people are using it. But I think there are a lot of people in my field that think, that have never really played with ChatGPT, and so they don't understand how good the responses are, if that makes sense. They think, well, what we do is so nuanced that there's no way it could do this. And so I know one thing I plan on doing for my department at our retreat this year is to actually show my faculty and say, no, we need to actually look at even at graduate level problems. I'll give my students graduate level problems. And what's really interesting is I can feed these problems into ChatGPT, for example. And what's funny is it gives me this beautiful solution. And it actually does amazing. And what's funny is it goes through these problems. It actually shows how to set them up. It gets a lot of the nuance until it gets all the way at the bottom of the problem, which is the actual calculation, because it doesn't do well as a calculator. But it does all the setup wonderfully. And I think that if people haven't taken the time to kind of play with it and to see what it can do, they don't realize how good some of these responses are. They think, oh, well, it can only do lower level stuff. But in reality, there's so much published work out there on a lot of what we do that it can do the more sophisticated things. And so I think there's a little bit of people just not realizing, especially in my field, how good it is, if that makes sense, for some of these problems that we do, especially at the graduate level. They think it's more of an undergraduate problem, when really it's, I don't even want to say the word problem, because I don't think that's right either. But, you know, its capabilities aren't just restricted to the undergraduate arena. It's also, you know, it can do things at the graduate level arena too. And really helping to see also not just, hey, it can produce these responses, but how it can aid our students with their responses. For me, we write, so I'm a statistician, we write tons of code, whether it be R or SAS or any other program. It's very good at helping with code. And at least for myself, when I write code, I rarely sit there siloed off and just write by myself. You know, I'm using Google, I'm using Stack Exchange, you know, I'm using these things to help me in practice. So why wouldn't I use this other tool in practice? And so thinking about ways, you know, circling back to how we teach students to use these things and the benefits, you know, teaching students to use these things to help them do things like write code. But then again, making sure they're not missing some of those education pieces on being able to read the code, understand what code is doing, and like those types of pieces. So I went a little bit on a tangent there. But yeah, so in my field, it's been very interesting.
Oh, it's perfect. Thank you. Anna, I am really interested in your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would just build on what they've both said, in the sense that there's this deep theme of, is it helping us to think better and learn better, or is it replacing those things, right? And there's can be a gray area. But having the discussion with students up front about, let's ask those questions as we use it. To me, transparency about how students are using it is key to that, to me, designing for their learning and knowing if they're learning and where the barriers are. So I've put a little section on the advice of a colleague that just says tools and rules in every assignment. And I tried to make explicit what would be acceptable uses that would stimulate thinking. And then to say, you know, no other AI use recommended, because this is designed for learning when you're working with your own ideas for the rest of it. So to try to make it explicit what those uses might be, which ones might get in the way, which ones wouldn't, establish a culture or an ethic around students disclosing, give them ways to disclose how they've used it and to reflect on that, whether it got in the way, whether it helped, whether it was a distraction. That seems like we've got to have that approach going in, because there will be these gray areas where maybe it's getting in the way, maybe it's helping, maybe for one student it helps and one student it doesn't. And one parallel is actually how students with disabilities have used AI-based tools for a long time for accessibility, and navigated those gray areas around, what is it that I need to access my learning, what is helping me, and what is getting in the way. So yeah, and around the discipline question, I would actually say that there's a lot of commonality. I really draw on the writing across the curriculum movement, which has tried to sort of share these practices from writing instruction around assigning steps in the process, focusing on what we're learning through the writing, reflecting on what it feels like to do the writing process, where we're stuck, what we're not understanding, when we have an aha moment. And I think some of that can theoretically be done across the disciplines. And it involves time and labor, right? So we've got to acknowledge that and figure out how to build that in. But there are some ways to do it with less labor, I think, to assign students steps in the process, even if you're not a writing teacher. And so that's where I'm kind of hopeful that we can have more of those conversations around process and reflection on what we're learning, rather than passing the test or producing the assignment. And that, you know, it's really helped me focus in my class on this question of what's helping us think in every assignment. and which strategies are working, and around that goal of having those aha moments, and sharing them. So yeah, that's my 2 cents.
Great, thank you.
And I really love that idea of like in the assignments, you called it tools and considerations or tools and tips. I think like what I really love about that is just that, like, because it's ubiquitous and it's out there, like we need, or students need, and even faculty need, like those tools and rules. um, like the frameworks, like how do I use this effectively? I really like, I think that's a really powerful thing, and I think that's for me when I've done work with faculty, like, well, what are ways that this could be helpful, that this is not that. So I really like that. And then you know, Amanda, to your piece about like, you know, from first year through grad school, these tools can be really like people can be using these in their learning, appropriate or not. And I think that's really true. And that's another thing that I don't think we always get when I hear people say like, well, I'm going to have them just do a personal reflection, and you know that you can't fake that. I'm like, I'll pull up and I'll be like, you know, write me a journal entry as a 13-year-old girl at a summer camp in the Adirondacks. um, so I think that that's a really like it's an interesting thing we can sometimes fool ourselves with, especially as we go and like we put in a question or two. And this is where I think it reminds me of what happens in a lot of the plagiarism discussions, or like the ideas around plagiarism, which is those who are likely to get caught are the ones who need help, the ones that are like doing it in a very robust rogue, like they are purposely not wanting to do anything. Like those are the ones that you're never gonna see. Like you're never gonna, or very rarely gonna realize that they're following a path for whatever reason to not do the work of the learning. And all of that's to say, I think that challenge with generative AI for for it to be really useful is you have to have a really good pool of knowledge of understanding how the tools work, and you actually have to have a really good pool of knowledge about the content to which you're asking. And I think that can be I think that's not something we're always aware of. But in between those, there's still a lot of ways you can go through with things. And I'm thinking about your example around the, like, you know, it worked through the process and then the output didn't work. And I think that's a thing where, regardless of the discipline and the level, is a thing where we have to grapple with.
Can I add in so I was thinking about like across disciplines, ways that these are useful. For me, one of the things I've been kind of playing with this idea of getting it to help students, not just with using it as a tool within, you know, like my curriculum, but also with soft skills. You know, I'm always thinking about ways to better prepare students for the future, for the workforce. And, you know, and they can help with things like time management. You know, when I think of, you know, my first gen students, they have particular needs. And one of the things that I think is really hard for first gen students and other students as well is how to write things like professional emails. You know, ChatGPT can help with, you know, the tone of the email, inclusion of information. You know, a lot of times students are embarrassed to ask questions when it comes to things like that. And here we have a tool for them that, if it's used appropriately, and consider some of those other concerns, but could help break down some of those barriers that students have. Lance, just like you said, the student that use it to summarize their notes. There's study skills that we could use. There's all kinds of, not necessarily, the content that I'm teaching them, but things related to being a student or being a professional that, these tools can help with, and showing students that and how to use them, I think, is really important.
Great, thank you. So it sounds like there's not a lot of guidance is generally what I'm getting from this conversation for faculty around these tools, and just seems like we're still, even though it's been really popular and in discussions everywhere, there's still a lot of uncertainties around this. And so one of our questions is actually based on some of your work, Anna. So Anna, you served in the MLA CCC task force on writing in AI, and one of the recommendations that was made to higher ed policymakers was to involve faculty during the process of developing and evaluating policies about AI rather than a top-down approach. And so I was wondering if you have any suggestions for faculty who are at institutions who maybe haven't read this recommendation, but these faculty maybe want to advocate for a collaborative approach for creating policies on AI.
Well, I think Lance has been my inspiration in this because he shared not only the college Unbound policy, but the whole description of the process, the iterative process that they were engaging in with students and their plans to sort of revisit it at different steps and get feedback from different groups. And so, I think that's a great model. I think also the blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights for education calls for educator input into any sort of administrative decisions about which software to use and what policies to adopt. So I think that document as well. I think that sometimes the administration will feel a lot of pressure to show that they're embracing AI. And so maybe that's good in a way because it gets them to invest in some professional development around it. And I think it can also create too much of a sort of a top-down pressure on faculty. But I think the model of compensating faculty time, using some of those kinds of professional development structures that are already in place to do communities of practice where people are spending time together, learning about this and brainstorming and discussing and coming up with policies, reflecting on how something is going. And leaning on whatever shared governance structure is already in place. So going through the academic senate makes a lot of sense. But I would love to hear from Lance on this because I know that you've shared a lot about your process with a lot of different institutions.
Thank you, Anna. And so yeah, I shared in the chat the link to like a talk I gave that outlines it. I'll also share a co-authored piece with Dana Gavin, Allison Papini, and Esther Brandon around cross-campus approaches to building a generative AI policy that was in EDUCAUSE review in December. I mean, I think so. I mean, my go-to is like we start with the students. Like I so much like it's not just top down, but like so much of how this is going to impact them and impact them much more quickly. Folks are emerging into the workforce now or into their industries and fields now, and there's an expectation of these tools. And so and because of the ubiquity of these tools, students, again, not all, but many have more awareness about them. And so to try to come up with stuff that doesn't include them just it grates against all of my thinking around what teaching and learn, like what I've evolved into my thinking about teaching and learning and what that means. So it should always involve students. And I really liked what we did at our institution is actually we're going to try to make this the model for other types of policies where we start with the students learning about it, trying things out, figuring out what makes sense, and then move it up rather than move it down. Outside of that, I think it's important to have a faculty from a variety of disciplines, and it's important to try to think about across all the different areas that this impacts institutions. Anna mentioned accessibility. Like they need to be in the room as much as IT, as much as HR, as much as the faculty and other parts of the institution, because one of the biggest challenges that I see with this is coming up with a policy that actually doesn't fit across the institution, meaning a lot of the discussion is either about the classroom or the institution as a whole. And those two things have to both be in alignment and also recognize there's going to be differences, because like your marketing department, the actual department at your school, the actual area of your school that does all of the advertisements and communication stuff, like they are going to need to use it differently than what we might see in the classroom, or there's going to be an expectation of needing to use it differently. So like trying to make sure you have that cross-campus view is really important to get it as well as we can, so that the different groups who may feel the need to use it more because of that's how the industry works, can, but also have some clearer guidance about what that looks like for an institution.
Yeah. Amanda, it seems like, oh, Anna, I'm sorry, you unmuted. Did you want
Oh,
to jump
yes,
in?
I was just going to add from our working paper, and on the one that we have coming out really soon on policy, emphasizes kind of a tiered approach, so that, as Lance was saying, you have some institution-wide policy that gives general guidelines, and then you have some discipline-specific policy, and then you have some instructor-specific policy. So you have room for some academic freedom for the instructor, but you also have some consistency. And we also call for iterative policy design. So returning and revisiting this as AI changes and our understanding of it changes, and a sense that we don't have to get it, we don't have to have all the answers, but we have to try something, and we have to have a plan for reflecting on that and continuing to revise.
I was going to add that I love this idea of involving students in this, in part because I feel like we have this really unique educational opportunity right now. You know, what AI tools look like 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 15 years from now, I can only guess. But my students that I have right now, they're likely to be involved in those conversations. And so allowing them that opportunity to even have that educational experience of talking about what these policies look like, what the ethics are, it's really just helping to even train them even better when they are the one making these policies, to think back to this instead of just being told this is what the policy is. So it's just this really unique point in time, it feels like, that we can involve them. And it's not just, you know, we're helping them make our policies, but again, we're helping to educate them.
Yeah, thank you. Can I go ahead and, well, I wanted to open it up to the audience, but I also wanted to circle back to a question if there's been more stuff that's been dropped since I've last looked at the chat. So audience, if you have any questions, please share them in the chat, or you can also raise your hand and you can ask directly. So that's another option. But in the meantime, I'll go ahead and ask one question I'm going to circle back to, which is, do you have any concerns about your intellectual property and the content being scraped by generative AI tools, especially when you're using them and integrating into paid products?
Yes, no, maybe. It changes minute by minute. Sorry. Anna, do you want to go? Okay. So, I mean, I have a very complex answer, because, like, on the one hand, I have a very, very radical view about, I wouldn't even say it's radical view about copyright, but I think our copyright system is entirely broken. And I say that as because my dissertation is focused on academic piracy, and we've created this system because of copyright where higher ed pays scholars to produce research. Those scholars produce that research and give it away to publishers for free. Publishers turn around and sell it back to higher ed at unaffordable rates. And the result is the rise of academic pirate platforms like Sci-Hub and LibGen. And so I've been interviewing scholars who are like, yeah, I either have to go and commit illegal acts so I can produce knowledge that ends up behind a paywall, or like I can't play the game. So that's my lens that I come through. And so there's a part of this that there's a part of me that's like some little element of anarchist of like, man, I hope this is what breaks copyright in a way that has us actually reimagine it for the 21st century. I'm a little schizophrenic. That's one bucket. And then the other bucket is like, yeah, I have a lot of concerns about people's work, particularly students, which is why I always tell faculty, like, the thing you do not put in there is students' work, of like their labor being put into these machines that will, you know, in some way help profit for these entities. So I bounce back and forth between those two. Meanwhile, like, I've been publishing with Creative Commons licensing for probably 12 years, both my academic works and all my blogs and stuff like that. And Like at the end of the day, there's a part of me that's just like, yeah, I put it out there because I want it to be used in our culture at large. And like, this is one of the ways that it ultimately is. So I'm a little sporadic in answering that. So I'll pass it along.
Yeah, I am too. I'm also coming from the open educational resources world, and I have my textbook in that format. And so I'm okay with them training on that. What I think is more concerning and what maybe could still be fixed is um, the way that like I built a GPT chatbot for people to interact with my textbook content. And I haven't been able to get it to quote when it's using whole chunks from the textbook, right? So these systems are not built to respect sort of academic values around source citation. They often, don't have a record of what source is behind a particular output, and they're not built to tell us that, and that creates some fundamental problems. And plagiarism. So, I'm very interested in continuing to follow the New York Times lawsuit and, where this goes. And I think that the question raises the bigger issue of how do we handle this question of, these tools have been built in a certain way. We may not agree with that way. We may have fundamental ethical concerns about it. And here we are. And what are we going to do? So for me, the message to students that we do have a role in shaping the future of these technologies, the regulation of them, that our voices are important to that we don't need to be intimidated by AI or think that it's a done deal and that it's inevitable. So sort of that civic element of the AI literacy is really important to me. If I am going to teach about it and invite them to use it, I also am inviting them to critique it and to be part of a societal conversation about it. So, if I invite them to use it, I often will say, let's see where it's biased, or let's see where it's inaccurate. Let's find the hallucination. Let's practice critiquing it, because that's both practical, that helps you work with it and add value to it, and it's bringing you into those ethical questions and where we can have power in relation to it in society.
I would say for me, my answer is similar. And also, in some ways, I don't know that I feel like I have the choice of whether or not my materials are used. In some ways, it feels so big that I feel powerless as to whether or not I actually have that choice, if that makes sense. And I will say for my friends that work in the movie industry or in fine arts, I think that conversation is also very different because I think there's a lot more fear about work being shared in that area than I would say in my particular area. So I just wanted to voice that since we don't have, someone from that field here.
Oh, that's an important point. Thank you. Gary, I see that you have your hand up. Would you like to ask a question?
I actually wanted to contribute a thought to you. So one of my former students is part of a group at Spawning AI. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Spawning AI. They're in HubSpot. I put a link up there, at least listed a name. And they have an API that they are working with the EU to write their policy on masking. They've deployed it with, I don't know how many institutions, but a vast number. They're a pretty fascinating group. Worth taking a look at Spawning AI. It's all open source stuff. You're welcome to it. They will help you join a group to protect your IP.
Very cool. Thank you. Well, we're almost finished here at time. Does anybody else have a question? I have one more question. We did briefly talk about it, but I want to allow others to join in. Okay. All right. Well, so my question is more big picture. So just zooming out and thinking about 5 years from now. So Amanda, you mentioned this. In 5 years from now, how do you envision the state of generative AI tools in higher ed? What do you think those conversations might be like? Nobody wants to go first?
I think I guess I feel like it's hard to predict. It's hard to predict in part because whenever we take that, like, we make those predictions, they're horribly wrong, or just vaguely on track. So I think for me, to some degree, we're gonna still see like some portions of us still not figuring it out. Um, like, I keep going back to William Gibson, the future is already here, it's just not equally distributed. That's not the exact quote, but that idea. And I mean, I feel like there's going to be some places where there is a lot of this going on in some really cool and interesting ways. There's going to be places where this is going on, where they're using and leveraging tools that's replacing instructors or supports. Like, particularly the institutions that are massive have already set up a very a cookie cutter approach to education. This feels like another way to cut the cookie faster. And so I think we're going to see kind of more certain ways of stratification around how AI plays out at different institutions. In that itself, so it's less about the tools and more how it plays out, and that itself becomes some of like where people lean or find themselves looking towards to go.
I don't mind to go next. Mine, much like Lance, I don't know where this is going to go in the future, but I'll voice a place that I hope it doesn't go to, if that makes sense. So maybe we can not go there if we voice concerns. I think one of my concerns about the future of generative AI is an equity issue. As these things get better and they can produce better things, of course, people are going to monetize. They're going to make money off them. And so one of the things that I worry in education is going to be that my students that have more money are going to be able to access better tools. And my students that don't have as much money won't be able to access those tools. And so I do worry about equity and a divide between, the haves and the have-nots when it comes to access to these different tools. And so I'm really hoping that that doesn't happen.
I think that will certainly be using more AI. And I think for learning still to be happening or to be happening better, the things that seem important to me are articulating what is the part of the learning process that needs to be human. Where is relationship crucial to the learning process? And how can we make space for that and put AI in its place alongside that? And how can we keep it in its place is one question I have, and emphasize the value of relationship and human communication and the meaning of that and the intrinsic motivation around that. And the other thing that seems key to me is transparency about when and how students are using it. So we know what is the student's work and learning and what is the AI. And without that, how can we design for learning or know if it's happening? So I think we will have to have forms of observing students, whether that's conferences or whether that's, in-person writing and exams, whether that's different ways to observe student process. And so I think we're going to have some ways to observe students. And so doing that in a way that's more collaborative with students, that's not as much in a surveillance policing mode, but in a how do we support your learning mode, and that's ethical in terms of privacy and data use is going to be key. So I think that the realism is we'll be working with AI, we've got to still emphasize the human, and we've got to figure out how to ethically observe students as they learn so that we can still be doing our best at teaching.
Absolutely. Yes, this was a wonderful conversation. Thank you all so much. We're right at the hour, so I'm going to go ahead and end our conversation. Thank you for all of the just insightful insights that you shared with us today. Thank you. And thank you, audience, for joining us. I hope that you all learned a lot. I sure did. Thanks. Bye, everyone.